All right, go for it.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever the heck in the world you are. It's V, the Girl Economist, with our main guy. It is the one and only London Paul of the SiriusReport.com. SiriusReport.com, folks. If you haven't gotten a chance to go there, subscribe to Sanity. Subscribe to Sanity. If there's a motto for the SiriusReport.com, it should be subscribe to Sanity. Go there, and for less than the price of a Starbucks latte, frappe, mochaccino, dunkachino, wacachino, frappe latte, you can get a subscription to the SiriusReport.com membership subscription for less than $5 a month. It's only $4.75 per month to radically change and shift your worldview. Subscribe to Sanity. You need to know the clarity of what's going on in the world. How the geopolitical chess pieces all fit. TheSiriusReport.com. That's spelled SIRIUS. TheSiriusReport.com. And with that being said, London Ball, how are you, buddy?
Yeah, good morning, V. Yeah, very well. We've actually got some very nice weather here, and it's actually a public holiday today because we have this May Day, which is the first Monday of May. And normally, public holiday weekends, the weather's just awful, but it's absolutely fantastic. So makes a change. I think we didn't really have spring. I think we jumped straight into summer.
Yeah, we had like two 90-degree days here in New York, and it was welcomed. It was very much needed.
Absolutely.
Paul, there's a lot of things going on. Many of these curmudgeon criminals that are in the FBI have been fired. They've been taken out. Sessions is next to useless. We have a new CIA idiot coming in who you and I were talking earlier this morning, who we both agreed is what is the difference between Haspel and Hillary Clinton. You and I failed to come to some sort of a deciphering, any sort of a difference that we can find. We just failed at doing that. We just couldn't do it. A lot of things going on in the Middle East, the Eurasian trade zone, Europe. I mean, you name it, it's going crazy. Where do you want to start, sir?
I think we need to devote quite a bit of time to the JCPOA and all the sort of bits that are hanging off it, because the 12th of May is rapidly approaching.
Yeah.
And there always has to be a bit of context with this, because people often say, well, why did the US ever sign up to this? It didn't make any sense. Well, actually, it makes complete sense. And I'm very apolitical. I don't have any interest in any political party, be it in my own country or anywhere else. So before anyone says that I'm a closet Obama supporter, I'm not. The truth is, it was an opportunity to bring Iran in from the cold. And the reason being, they were able to monitor the Iranian nuclear program completely. I mean, the IAEA does regular inspections, and as to this day says they're fully compliant with the nuclear program. The other thing is, it was an opportunity to remove economic sanctions. And part of the rationale, and one thing that Kerry came out with actually in an interview was, and he said, was the fear of the US dollar losing its relevance in the world. Now, okay, we can discuss that whole thing in a totally separate conversation. We've mentioned it many times. But yeah, the risk was of the world de-dollarizing the longer you kept sanctions in play. And of course, what were the benefits? Potentially, of course, it's not happened, unsurprisingly, but you could have had huge economic benefits for the US. There could have been massive energy deals, infrastructure. The sad fact is, because the US has this policy now of, well, maybe we'll leave, maybe we'll tear up the deal, all it has actually done is accelerated the very thing that the Obama administration we're trying to avoid, and that's de-dollarization. Because what have all nations done as a result of this? They did it as a result of Ukraine. All this cabal foreign policy just meant accelerated de-dollarization. And the other major point for the JCPOA is to prevent the risk of direct military confrontation between, let's say, Israel and Iran, or, for example, now, the risk of that actually happening is pretty small. But in a way, yes, it was a sensible move. Now, the one thing that's coming out is all this idea that the Netanyahu thing, which we're not going to go into masses of detail, suffice to say, everything he said predates about 2009, and most of it was 2006, 5, 4, and so on. The real issue is this nuclear deal is nothing about Iran's nuclear capability. And we have to go back and look at some of the history that precedes sort of 2018 and goes back to 79. There's been a desire for Iranian regime change for decades. That was a cabal CIA plan. It's not some newfangled idea that suddenly appeared in the last 6 months. It's been going on for decades. And are we really surprised by this? Because what happened in Ukraine, cabal regime change. Syria, an attempt to have cabal regime change. Egypt, there was an attempt to have cabal regime change. Afghanistan, cabal regime change. Iraq, after Saddam, cabal regime change, even though the US backed Iraq in the Iraq-Iran war. So which is another example of why there was clear elements to, at the time back in the 80s to destabilize Iran by the Iran-Iraq war. So there's been a cabal intent to destabilize Iran for decades. And we've also had sanctions imposed on Iran for decades in the process. And now somehow, as someone got in touch with me saying, well, there's this idea that Iran's under the control of the Kabbalists and that regime change is the solution. Well, actually, it's the reverse, because Iran is not a Kabbalist state. And the regime change is to do precisely what the Kabbalists want to do. Because let's face it, what has Iran done in the last, since the JCPOA came into existence? It's hardly behaved like a Kabbalist state when it signs economic deals with China, signs military deals with Russia, wants to sign deals with Europe. So, for example, Total is one example. It's publicly abandoned the US dollar and as recently said, it wants to use the euro instead. I mean, that doesn't sound to me like a capitalist state. Does it sound like it to you? No. And who said that, of course, in the past? Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi. And look what happened to both of them when they decided to do it. So there's a clear precedent that proves categorically that this idea that there's some great plot to remove the cabal and the regime change is all perfectly acceptable within that parameter. I'm sorry, just doesn't stack up. And if people want to go back and read all the history of what happened in Iran in the 80s, the 90s, in the 2000s, and leading up to the JCPOA, after all, Iran itself has spent over a decade trying to get the deal put in place. Why? Because they had no intention of creating nuclear weapons. And as all the evidence Netanyahu and everyone else has produced, it was all theoretical. It was all paperwork. It was all ideas going back well over a decade ago. There was no reality to it. The reason Iran negotiated was exactly why North Korea is, and why we've said this before. It's a way of getting themselves out of the sanctions loop and enabling the nation to have some economic strength again after spending decades being crippled by the cabal. And that's the truth. They tried, and it was all why? Because they wanted to bring about regime change. It's why, notice, suddenly we've had a major attack on the Iranian currency, the rial, trying to collapse the bank. That's another attempt to destabilize Tehran, to remove the government and put a cabal sympathetic government in place. It's why they had all the failed demonstrations earlier on this year, which we discussed. And that's the sort of nuts and bolts of some of the background. I mean, and what do we see? Richard Grenell, he's the newly confirmed US ambassador to Germany. He said that German companies should stop trading with Iran because Tehran sponsors terrorism. Does it? And why did he say it's a state sponsor of terrorism? Apparently, according to Grenell, they spend billions of dollars a year to spread terrorism around the world. So why would a country want to do business with them? So I think apparently it's incumbent on him to explain to German businesses that they do not want to do business inside of Iran. Well, maybe someone should explain to Grenell precisely what Iran's been doing to destroy terrorism in Syria, along with Assad and along with the Russian, and to a lesser extent, elements within the US. But a lot of the time, they've not done anything of the sort. They've actually turned a blind eye, as we know, to the terrorism that's gone on in Syria. And Grenell actually has accused Iran of destabilizing Syria. How he comes to that conclusion, it just beggars belief. But then, of course, what do we find out? Grenell's a sharp critic of Iran's nuclear program. So no surprise, he backs the horse that wants trade to be stopped by the Germans. And of course, this proves the point. It's got absolutely nothing to do with Iran's nuclear capability. It's everything to do with stopping Iran, having trade relations with anyone in the world, be it the Russians, the Chinese, or the Europeans for that matter. And then, of course, Giuliani comes out and quotes and says that Trump actually wants regime change in Iran. Now, do I really believe that if Trump knew the reality of what's going on, he'd want regime change in Iran? No, I don't. I just don't simply buy that at all. But that's the belief that he's come to now. Who is actually giving him the idea that that's a sensible way forward? And then we hear that someone said to me, got in touch with me saying, well, I've been led to believe Iran never signed the JCPOA. I go, well, okay, if they didn't sign it, do you seriously imagine the AIEE would carry out regular inspections if they weren't? And let's be honest, the same people who are prepared to approve of the North Korean denuclearization program with Trump, saying Trump's all behind it, are now suggesting that the JCPOA is a cabal deal, and it amounts to precisely the same thing. As we said, it's the removal of economic sanctions. And what concerns me a little bit about this whole JCPOA is it's become a spin between it's the Democrats who wanted the JCPOA and the Republicans don't want it. It's the bad versus good. The Democrats implemented it and therefore the Republicans have to end it. And the difference is the Kabbalists are being backed into a corner over the North Korea. And that's the basic difference between the JCPOA and respect of North Korea. The problem is, I'm now seeing that the Trump administration is being backed into a corner regarding the JCPOA. And then, as a slight aside, what concerns me is the fact that Pyongyang note, and we made reference to this, about the role of the US in the whole North Korean or the Korean Peninsula developments. They've dismissed the role the US has played, and they've actually come out and said that the US is looking to stifle progress towards denuclearization and reunification in the Korean Peninsula. That's a rather disturbing development. As a side note, what do we notice that's happened in Ukraine? The US has given Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. Well, they admitted they gave them to them several weeks ago. There's no doubt. I mean, there's a big, huge discussion for another time, maybe about developments in Ukraine, but certainly Poroshenko is now on a firm war footing, and there's suggestions that the US is prepared to give an even more artillery to Ukraine, which is completely flouts the Minsk Accords totally. It puts Ukraine totally in violation of them, even though they've been in violation of them since they were signed, and the West turns a blind eye. Then what do we happen in Syria? Well, I wrote an article I put on the website about the risk of chemical weapons provocation with suggestions the US are behind it. We hear there's more US bases being put up in northern Syria, southern Syria. You go to Afghanistan, it's the heaviest bombing that's gone on for years. There's more US troop deployment, and I'm sorry to say, but the US foreign policy, and I'm going to use this term, is like a neocon wet dream at the moment. This is exactly what the neocons love. It's destabilizing countries. It's going into every country I've listed. These are all recent developments where they've started to come to pass in the last year, 18 months. That is a very disturbing trait, and it shows a very dysfunctional US foreign policy. And I don't believe Trump's intelligent. He's not stupid. But why is Trump being duped into allowing all these things to happen, which is highly detrimental? And in the process, all it's going to do is isolate the US on the world stage increasingly. Maybe it's a good point if we stop now. There's much more we can discuss about the JCPOA and everything that hangs around it, but maybe that's a good point to stop. But I have great concerns when I look at recent developments in US foreign policy, and it just completely flouts the whole Trump idea of we want to be scaling down on military exercises and military force abroad. It's costing too much money. I want to leave Syria. And then all these developments happen. And I now have concerns about the fact that it's Pyongyang's perspective, but they believe the US is looking to stifle progress. Well, what's going to happen when Trump meets Kim Jong-un? And we said only last week the next 4 weeks is going to be very pivotal towards which direction the US is going. And it's not certain, but there are certainly indications of reasons to be a bit concerned. And that's being quite polite, I think.
I mean, absolutely. We have the situation with North Korea, the things that are going on with Kim Jong-un. What is the meet up to that? The situation in Iran, and even till now, we have idiots out there saying that Iran is the biggest sponsor of terrorism. These are the axioms of the axiomatic American foreign policy that just simply that the mass people just don't get it, Paul. And this mass conditioning is just absolutely insane.
Well, yeah, and the problem is, it's like, the damage this is going to do to the US going forward is incalculable, because all it's doing, I mean, let's hope when Trump meets Kim Jong Un, it's a productive meeting and it moves the process forward. But if the US is seen on the world stage to stifle it or inhibit progress, the world's going to turn around and go, look, North Korea's gone out of a limb to agree to your conditions, things you'd like to see happen from a position of strength, not weakness. And that was the other point that Pyongyang were keen to make, is we're doing this from a position of strength. And they are. It's not a position of weakness. But if the US doesn't play along with this and encourage it, promote it, the world's going to say, hang on, what are you playing at? And it's the same with the whole JCPOA. The world's going to turn around and say, look, your whole basis of why you're so annoyed and is because you feel, well, at some point, the Iranians can start developing nuclear weapons, or they can, have the capability to develop them. And you made some, discussion about the fact of this idea that there was some nuclear facility in Syria,
northern Syria. The most ridiculous statement I've ever heard in my life.
It is the most ridiculous, and I can speak from experience. I've said this before. I was a physicist, and I've studied nuclear physics. I even spent a bit of time in an experimental nuclear reactor facility to learn how things work. And trust me, if you want to make anything nuclear facility, they are a decade away at the very least, 20 years away from being able to achieve that. And the idea that suddenly they managed to create this facility in northern Syria is farcical. Bear in mind, the whole world knows exactly what's going on in northern Syria every day of the week. And somehow this has been going on all this time. And the US didn't know about it. The Russians didn't know about it. The Chinese, nobody knew about it, but it was going on. I'm sorry, it's just, and it's these kind of comments that are very damaging, because it skews people's perspective as to what the reality is with Iran. And it's very, very unhelpful, and it's very damaging when we're trying to get the reality of what's going on. Bear in mind, we're talking about an understanding of what's gone on in Iran for decades, not a sort of sudden knee-jerk reaction to something. And I have a horrible feeling there's elements that are just trying to play the Democrats against the Republicans. So if the Democrats do something, we have to scrap it because it's not something the Republicans did, and therefore we have to trash it. And it just strip the Democrat aspect out of it, strip the Republican aspect out of it, and just look at the sensible geopolitical reality of it. And then we need to look at the economic reality. And when you start to look at the economics, this is where you start to realize what's really, really going on here. Because as we said, it has nothing to do with Iran's nuclear capability or the lack of it. Because what after Netanyahu's debacle, which actually is completely backfired and blown up in his face, the IAEA came out and said, we're not reviewing anything you've sent us because we've seen it all before. And Iran is fully compliant. But in terms of the economic reality, the truth is, we have to factor the Saudis into this, is because Saudi Arabia needs oil trading significantly north even of $70 per barrel. You're talking probably $80, $90 a barrel. That's to balance its budget and its trade deficit. And also because MBS has got this gigantic Vision 2030 for structural reforms in the country, which he fails to actually appreciate requires trillions of dollars of money. And who's going to provide the trillions of dollars of money? It's rather like the US wanting trillions of dollars of money for infrastructure and doing everything it can to irritate, aggravate, and upset the Chinese on a near daily basis. So he falls into the same trap. And as much as the current price of oil, it's still the deficit of to GDP in Saudi Arabia is very high. And now we know precisely why the oil price has been manipulated higher. Because the truth about all these cuts in oil production is simply not true. It's done by hedge funds, and it's done by other people with an interest to drive the price further north. Now, the interesting point is we're right at the point now where Iran's oil output has risen back to pre-sanction levels. It's nearly 4 million barrels per day. And what have they done? This cabal state, it's signed new exploration and production deals with Europe, China, and Russia. And it's likely to see the acceleration of Iran's oil output to probably 5 million barrels per day, or even higher. And just in case someone's jumped in the middle of this conversation, I was joking about Iran being a cabal state. Now, to get oil that high, the price, Iran's production needs to be cut. Oh, so what a surprise that suddenly there's a desire to frame the Iranians and to invoke more sanctions on them. Why? To cut back oil production. So by cutting oil production back, it will drive the price of oil even higher. What's also kind of slightly disturbing is the US has always denied having any presence in Yemen, and now there's an admission that the US Green Berets are present in Yemen. Why are they there? It's a proxy effort, we know, against Iran. So it's further example of trying to engage Iran in that respect. And the Kabbalists are desperate to prevent Iran becoming a fully fledged economic member of the international community. That's been self-evident for 40 years nearly. And now, of course, as we said, there's the run on the Iranian currency, the rial. That's a blatant attempt by the Kabbalists to wreck the Iranian economy and somehow destabilize the government and get it to be overthrown. Well, that's not going to happen. I mean, as much as they think they can try, it's not going to work. And we also know that Israel's terrified of an economically resurgent Iran. And we note suddenly how Israel's now apparently threatening Assad, that if he allows to Iran to continue to have a presence in Syria, then there's going to be consequences, and they'll take action against. And there was even the statement of eliminating Assad. Okay, it's rhetoric, but here's the nation Iran that's made a huge contribution to defeating Daesh, who've been supported by the Kabbalists, as we know. And there's no doubt Israel and the US want to cripple the Iranian government of money. So pulling out of the JCPOA, in the eyes of and I'm not saying this is Trump, and when I use the US and Israel, I have to say Kabbalist influence or Kabbalist interest. They want to allow the JCPOA to collapse so the US can reimpose sanctions on Iran. And they think it will cut them out of the global banking system again. Of course, once again, how stupid they are is because the world's a very different place. And once again, the Kabbalists, and we keep saying this, are shooting themselves in the foot time and time again. And why? Because Iran can get to trade its oil using the petro-yuan via the SIPS payment system. And note the timing once again of the announcement. We said it's not about the petro-yuan being adopted overnight, just look at the catalytic effect of what you're going to see happen. Well, Iran's a great example of that. And what have we also seen the Chinese doing? They're putting huge pressure on the Saudis because Sinopec's reduced oil imports of Saudi oil around 40% in 1 month. That's a huge reduction. And they're citing these price tariffs from the Saudis as being unacceptable. Unipec's also saying there's unreasonable prices because they don't follow the correct pricing methodology. And there's other Chinese refineries said they're cutting their imports from Saudi by 10, 15, 20%. So there's a clear move to pressure the Saudis. And no doubt this is in part to do with adopting the petro-yuan, but also to do with the fact of the Saudis' role in terms of destabilizing Iran. The other thing, of course, is, and as much as we say the Saudis need trillions of dollars for this 2030 vision, the other thing is who's gonna back the Aramco IPO? Well, it's likely to be China. Well, what do? Start pissing the Chinese off? I mean, because it's clear China as well has other options in the oil market and it doesn't want to pay for oil in dollars, so it can force the Aramco deal and say we want payment in petro yuan. Also, what's China doing, which China does very well? It's already getting significant imports from Brazil, and they've risen sharply in terms of oil. And it's rather like the tariffs that have been the whole trade tariff war. China's already diversifying its supply, and this is what China will do. The one thing China will never do, the Russians don't do, it's the art of war. As the saying goes, don't throw the person under the bus. Just let them impale themselves on their own swords, and that's what they're doing. And don't know why, but the Trump administration seems to think because of the spread between Brent and WTI, it's going to encourage China to import US oil instead. Well, it's simply not going to happen, because you don't start aggravating and upsetting and irritating the Chinese with a trade war that they instigated. And another cabal failure is they think removing Iran from the SWIFT payment system is going to work. Well, Iran's had to bypass SWIFT for decades. And also, China and Russia, as we know, have viable SWIFT alternatives in the MIR and SIPs. Iran has little access to the US and European banking institutions after these decades of sanctions anyway. And of course, what's largely not known is that Turkey's helped Iran survive without SWIFT. And it's going to continue to do so. Why? Because the US has, well, apart from trying to have Erdogan overthrown, which failed, the other thing that's annoying the Turks no end is the US's position on Kurds in northern Syria and also in Turkey for that matter. So this anti-US sentiment just gathers momentum, and Turkey will also help Iran. So all they've done in the process is drive nations to support Iran. And the idea that you can go back and start to instigate sanctions like they were 5, 10, 20 years ago is simply not going to work. So economically, it's an utter disaster for the US to do this. And maybe, that's a good point to stop again, because then we need to discuss, and there's quite a lot to do with the political fallout of this, which is pretty huge. But I think that's a good point to stop in terms of some of the economic impact or the anticipation of it, how the Iranians will get by without these problems, because as we've said many times, China has their back economically. Russia has their back militarily, and also you can factor in nations like Turkey in the process, and Qatar, of course, who flipped away from the Western cabal also.
The situation with Qatar, a longtime buddy of the U.S. deep state, rich in LNG, how is that affected? Especially, we hear about the failure of Yemen. How's that correlate, Paul?
Well, the thing is, if we look at Qatar, I mean, the whole plan originally was, and to remove Assad, was to put the energy pipeline through Qatar, through Saudi, through Syria, in that way. And of course, once the Assad, idea of collapsing the Assad government failed, then of course, because Qatar started to play ball with the Russians and the Turks and the Iranians, the Saudis decided to have this economic blockade that failed, and all it did in the process was drive Qatar further into the arms of the Iranians, the Turks, and the Russians. And of course, the move now is to effectively put the pipeline from Qatar across the Persian Gulf into Iran, and that way through Iraq and into Syria, and bypasses Saudi altogether. So another completely failed initiative. In terms of what's gone on in Yemen, of course, I mean, and the worrying thing is, we just mentioned the fact that the US are now having boots on the ground, so to speak, even though arguably they have for some time. And you've got the Saudis and the UAE fighting this proxy war with the Iranians. And of course, what have they done with the Qataris as well? Now they're basically trying to imply that Qatar's this failed state who backs terrorists all the time. And the basically the relationship between the Saudis and the UAE and Qatar has collapsed. And therefore, it's another example of how the cabal elements have completely failed to appreciate what's going on. We have to be extremely grateful for that fact. But their crass stupidity knows no bounds. But the problem is that the Trump administration, and I think this is where we'll come on to the political fallout. and it could be immense, and it's very, very detrimental to the US. But we'll come to that in a minute, because there's quite a lot that needs to be discussed about that. But if you look at the Middle East, I mean, we know there's always been a strong relationship for a long time between the Saudis and the Israelis. But if you factor in, it's really Saudi and Israel looking for the US to back them against the rest of the Middle East, because the rest of the Middle East doesn't want anything to do with either of them. Certainly Iraq doesn't. Certainly Syria doesn't. Qatar doesn't. Oman doesn't. Bahrain doesn't. I mean, Bahrain's, as we said before, is rotating. He's signing energy deals with the Russians and wants to work with the Chinese, and the list goes on. So those two nations are isolating themselves. The one thing the US needs to do is walk away from it and not get involved. But as we'll discuss shortly, to do with it all depends on the decision of what the US does with respect to the JCPOA, and we'll come to that in a minute.
What do you think is the next moves here with the cabal? Some of the recent purges in the FBI. You want to comment on that, Paul?
Well, I've said this. I've said this all along, and I understand the frustration, because we have frustrations in the UK. I understand why everybody wants people arrested and wants people removed from office. My view with the whole Mueller investigation and everything surrounding it is do nothing. Just leave him. Eventually, he'll fall on his own sword. If you remove him from office, I think the collateral damage would be far greater. I think there's optimism and sign, and you mentioned Devin Nunes. I think he's doing a great job. He's one person who's getting the facts out there, getting the reality of situations and dealing with it in an appropriate manner. He's put Sessions now in a difficult position by subpoenaing him, or the failure for him to respond to the request for information. I think these are great developments, but it's not going to happen overnight. And it's better to let the cabal, it's the old art of war, let the cabal destroy themselves, because they've got a great job. They're doing it in terms of foreign policy everywhere, and they have done for a number of years. Let them implode and destroy themselves. It's a largely, I mean, I've used the term on Twitter, it's kabuki theatre. It's largely, that's all it is. It will all play itself out in the end. The whole Mueller investigation will collapse. We know there's no evidence, because if they had evidence, they'd have nailed Trump a year ago. I mean, it's self-evident that there is no evidence. We know that. So leave these people to do what they eventually. I think the rampant corruption inside every arm of the US administration, and the same in any other country. Let's not just portion blame to the US. It exists everywhere in the Western world. They will get rooted out. They'll be removed, and eventually the US will have a fighting chance to form a real government that's free from corruption and can then start to rebuild the US. And I don't doubt that, but I don't think the idea of firing people is actually it will be counterproductive. That's only my viewpoint. I know people will disagree, but I think we're starting to see how they're falling on their own swords. And by doing that, it gives ammunition for people like Nunes and other people who are trying to do a great job in highlighting the corruption, highlighting the deficiency of the administration in dealing with problems. It's given them the ammunition to start to be able to go, okay, through your inactivity, through the fact you haven't done this or you didn't do that, we can then act on that. But if you go for the jugular with them, I don't think you'll get the same degree of progress and the same degree of resolution. Yeah, things will take longer. And someone on the chat room said, well, in the meantime, lots of people suffer. And I go, yeah, that's true. But from my perspective, by doing this, in the long run, less people will suffer. I think if you try to go for the jugular, I think more people will suffer as a result of it. But there's no doubt the wheels are slowly falling off. But as we've said, it's event driven. There's no time scales. Don't expect things to happen in May or June. Yeah, they could happen tomorrow. They may happen next week. They may not happen for 6 months or 3 months. That's what's going to happen. It's very patient sapping. And, for people like us, I mean, I've been aware of what's gone on in the world for 26, 27 years now. And I spent years going, do I even know anyone else who has a clue what's going on? So, yeah, it is frustrating, but I always never lost the belief that eventually the world would change. And it has. And the steps forward have been enormous in the last few years. But the frustrating thing from Trump is that Trump, particularly with US foreign policy, is being very badly blindsided and misguided. And it's questionable who's actually doing that. We know there's some obvious contenders, people like Bolton. I mean, he's got a track record of doing precisely that. And, his appointment was ridiculous and should never have happened. And quite how anyone persuaded Trump to do that beggars belief. It suggests to me that there are elements within the US military who have some influence over Trump and are advising Trump according to what they want to see happening and not what's in the best interest of the US as a nation. And I think that's why he's making some very poor decisions with respect to Iran. He's made poor decisions with respect, well, one minute he makes great decisions with respect to Syria, then gets very poor advice and launches a missile attack, and we won't go into all that detail, but it's that kind of problem. But I think in terms of the JCPOA, the political fallout is more significant because, okay, we're back to the three-prong attack. Does he pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, as a lot of people are suspecting he will do? Does he stay in it, or does he try to seek some compromise? Well, a lot of people feel he's going to pull out of the Iran deal in the next week or less than a week. Now, what's Iran done? It's ruled out new talks. It's calling the current agreement non-negotiable, and why should it? And the big thing is the US's allies are continuing to back it. The only nation that's not, or two nations, is Israel and the US now. That's a world of difference between the military attack that was launched in Syria, where he had the backing of France, he had the backing of Germany, although they didn't want to center it, and lots of European nations backed it, the UK. They don't have that backing. And they effectively say, of course, the European allies, and people are saying, oh, well, they're cabal-controlled countries, so it's a cabal attitude. That is a very simplistic viewpoint of how the world currently operates. They're all saying the deal's been essential to reining in Iran's nuclear program. Well, Iran never had a nuclear program, but okay, it doesn't matter. The reality is, in a way, yes, it stops it, but it basically diffuses a lot of potential tensions in the region.
You want to know something? Here's the thing. I think we've been conditioned in the West to think of one thing with nuclear. They've simplified and stupefied the word nuclear. They simplified it in the sense that they nonchalantly would say the word, oh, Iran has a nuclear program. And you and I have, touched base on this a few times before. People do not understand the magnitude of difficulty it takes from taking, even if you have a nuclear power plant, to actually having and developing fissionable nuclear material that you can utilize in a bomb or a weapon. These are miles and miles and miles away different, and they play so precisely into the ignorance of the average American, where they think that a nuclear bomb is something you can do in your own garage. It's
there is. No. Oh, it is. They're poles apart, and Iran is years away. Even if they were tomorrow to start a nuclear program, they're years and years from ever getting close to it. And put it this way, if they were, the West would know immediately what they were doing. The idea that they don't. But I think the other problem is that the real reason as well behind wanting to destabilize the Iranian government and causing economic sanctions is the Trump administration's been kind of coerced into saying, well, it actually also adds to grievances in the Middle East because, the Iranians are stationed in Syria and they're going to take over Syria and they're going to start launching attacks on Israel. And then, well, there's all this tie-up between Hezbollah and the Iranians. So therefore, it's a major problem. I mean, look, we've had the Lebanese elections and Hezbollah is the biggest party. So Israel's foaming at the mouth about that now, essentially saying that, Lebanon is Hezbollah, and therefore we'll treat Lebanon as though, as we would treat Hezbollah. I mean, but it's just paranoia induced. I mean, Trump said it's a horrible agreement for the United States. Well, what's horrible about it? It stopped Iran developing nuclear weapons. They have inspectors in there all the time. Okay, it opened up the Iranian economy. Well, why didn't the US jump in and go, okay, in the spirit of goodwill, let's take investments in your country. Let's, take part and redevelop your nation and actually get some economic benefit. No, they didn't. And Trump's also said, well, I wouldn't rule out negotiating a new deal, which kind of implies, well, we want to change the rules of engagement. Well, let's be honest. The one thing the US doesn't do well is stick to its treaties and things that it's passed. So Iran could rightly say, well, you won't comply with the JCPOA, so why would we even trust you to renegotiate a deal? And Rouhani said, well, the US is bullying Iran, and that's how Iran feels. And Iran's long claim Washington isn't fully complying with its side of the deal. Well, no, it isn't, because it hasn't revoked the economic sanctions, which it was supposed to do. And at the weekend, there was the foreign minister, Zarif, made a statement, and he said, let me make it absolutely clear once and for all, we'll neither outsource our security, nor will we renegotiate or add on to a deal we have implemented in good faith. And absolutely, they have done. I mean, and everybody says it, except the US and Israel. The Atomic Energy Authority, every nation agrees because they have. And also, the other thing that's interesting is there's a sort of political dimension to this in the US, because whilst the 12th of May deadline's portrayed as this kind of make or break decision for Trump, it's not necessarily that simple, because under a law passed by Congress, obviously Trump has to determine periodically whether to continue waiving sanctions linked to transactions with Iran's central bank. Now, the 2015 accord required the US to lift those sanctions, so if they go back into effect, the US will be deemed in violation of the agreement. Now, maybe Trump declares he's backing out of the deal, perhaps he reimposes sanctions, but puts a delay before those sanctions take effect. Why would he might do that? Well, then they can try and coerce the European nations to make fresh kind of concessions towards fixing the deal. And even Mike Pompeo said, well, there's much diplomatic work to be done. He didn't exactly say what those diplomatic work referred to. Was it Iran? Was it Europe? I suspect it's more likely to be Europe. But here's the issue Washington's not grasping. And this bothers me greatly. Even if the US looks to threaten to reimpose sanctions and ramp up pressure, getting to agree Iran to the negotiating table, it's a non-starter. Because we know that the US negotiators have met with France, the UK and Germany in an effort to reach consensus on changing the agreement. And the UK, France and Germany have said, told the US to stay in the agreement and leave it as it is. And there's all this talk, well, we made progress on some aspects of renegotiating the deal with Iran. And the biggest issue is this sunset clause, which means that many of the provisions inside the JCPOA will expire in a number of years, and then Iran is, in theory, allowed to start enriching uranium to levels that they can make fissile material, even if they want to. But what's happened today? The French and German foreign ministers have said that governments will uphold the Iran nuclear deal regardless of Trump's decision. And they've said we're absolutely determined to save it. And Iran has no reason to agree to tougher deal without concessions. Because as we said, if the US isn't honouring its agreement already to the JCPOA, what's the reassurance they're going to honour any future agreement? And that's the biggest problem. It's back to trust again. It's that big word with the letter T. And then we come back to the economic issues we've already discussed, which Washington fails to understand. The idea, well, Tehran needs to accelerate economic reforms and overhaul its banking system if the US quits the JCPOA. Well, that's not simply the case. And the European strategy is one of containment, for Iran to stay in the nuclear deal. And this is on the basis that the US wants change. There's talk. Their idea is we'll get Iran to stay in the nuclear deal as long as possible, because maybe after 2020, the US will have a new president. That's the reality of the comments that are coming out of Europe. They actually think, well, maybe there's a way around this whereby maybe Trump won't be president in 2020 and we'll get around it that way. But, Iran took over a decade to negotiate this deal. And what was quite telling is that today, Iran's talked about walking away from the deal. Now they're saying, well, either, all we wanted from the JCPOA to be guaranteed and supplied by non-US partners, And basically, well, if the mischief makers in the US get cut out, then we, as the European partners and everyone, less the US, can take our own path. What did Putin and Macron had a phone conversation? They've said they want to preserve and implement in full the JCPOA agreement on the Iranian nuclear program. That phone conversation happened as a result of initiative from the French. Now, what is also telling is the Iranians have already said that they want to stay in this agreement, but they've already been having discussions about what happens if the US leaves with the IAEA. That suggests to me that Iran is looking to stay in the deal, as is every other nation. If the US walks away, it's total isolation on the world stage. The political fallout will be enormous. The economic fallout will be enormous. And it's just the most insane decision for the US to walk away from it or try to renegotiate anything, because Iran's not doing anything wrong. And in a way, the US wants to back itself into a corner with the Israelis and the Saudis. That they need to learn the lesson. Just don't do that. They got backed into a corner by Kim Jong Un, and then now there's no. And if they try to wriggle out of it, they're going to be seen on the world stage as pariahs because they're not allowing the peace process and denuclearization and unification to happen. It's the same principle now. Nations have backed the US into a corner. As the US stays in the agreement, everyone goes fine. If the US tries to renegotiate, nations go, hang on what basis do you want to renegotiate this? Because Iran's staying in the deal and Iran's not going to be prepared to renegotiate. But if the US walks away, I think it's very, very, very detrimental and a very serious development. And this is why this idea that was out there that, oh, well, the US is going to walk away from this deal because it's a cabal instigated deal and it benefits the cabal. No, the US walks away from it, then they're going to cause themselves irreparable damage, potentially, and very likely. And in the process, they're going to effectively try to do the bidding of the cabal themselves, who want the JCPOA scrapped. And it may sound ridiculous, but in all honesty, the Obama administration went in and go, well, it's about time we started to treat Iran differently. We don't actually treat them as this, pariah nation. And we need to, because there are many reasons why it would be beneficial to bring them in from the cold. That is a reality. That may sound implausible, unbelievable. Little people will be foaming at the mouth for me saying this because I'm implying that, that somehow the Obama administration tried to do a good thing. But the JCPOA is a good deal. Okay, it may not be perfect, but nothing is perfect. But it's a huge step in the right direction to de-escalate tensions and problems inside the Middle East. And of course, who are the only nations who really are really upset about this is the Saudis and the Israelis, and the US sadly has been sucked into that sort of jet stream of belief. And at the end of the day, it's just the US should just walk away and say, leave the deal as it is, and let's actually start to rebuild relations with nations around the world instead of going on this permanent war footing, permanent aggressive stance. Because ultimately, all it will do is isolate the US on the world stage precisely when we have this economic reset, when we have this complete financial new paradigm, economic, social paradigm. The US gets left out in the cold because nations go, but all you've ever done is want to wage war on nations. It's all about aggression. It's about bullying nations, and we don't trust you. This is an opportunity to try and readdress that. And if there's one thing the Trump administration needs to do, it really needs to start to look at the foreign policy. Someone inside his administration needs to sit down with Trump and go, look at the logic, look at the reality of what is going on here. And these are the reasons why you need to walk away from here. You need to change your attitude here, because in the end, the risk is when the world changes, the US is going to be, people are going to sit there and go, sorry, we don't want to deal with you anymore. We're going to put you in on the bench, so to speak, and you've got to prove to us that we can trust you. And that's the big problem. We mentioned it a couple of weeks ago that trust is a huge problem. I mean, and the nations like the UK, France, and Germany are not backing this deal because it's a cabal deal and their cabal nations are backing it because it's eminently sensible to do so. And all these nations are not cabal nations like they were. They're in the process of rotating to various degrees. It's like Germany, we know, spent years talking to the Russians and is looking to reintegrate Russia into Europe and vice versa. And, Macron gets a lot of stick, but Macron has done a lot to try and build relations with the Russian. But once again, I think the biggest failing of the Trump administration and Macron and May was to believe completely duff intelligence regarding Syria and chemical weapons, why they went and launched the missile attacks in Syria. I think the truth is, if they knew the truth, they'd be appalled by what's happened. But that's the level of manipulation of governments and why. And we always come back to the point, why is the Trump administration now suddenly going, well, actually, we're not going to fund the white helmets anymore? Now, bear in mind, where did all the intelligence come from saying that the Syrians were responsible for the chemical weapons attack in Douma? It was from the white helmets. So what does that suggest? The US administration finally realizes they were lied to. The intelligence is duff. The intelligence is unreliable. So if the intelligence is unreliable for that, is their intelligence reliable for Iran? Is their intelligence reliable for other nations? It's not a quantum leap of judgment to say, hang on, we need to assess everything and start to go, yeah, we need to pull out of Syria. We need to stop supporting in any shape or form the Poroshenko government in Syria, in Ukraine, etc., 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 and start to rebuild things while they've got chance. Just stop having these ridiculous tantrums with China about trade deals, because the truth is, they went to Beijing and they came back with nothing. They'll spin it every which way out, but they came back with nothing. In fact, I had a rather crude analogy about what actually happened, but I'm not going to use that because it might upset people. But suffice to say, a certain part of their anatomy was cut off and handed to them on the way out of Beijing. That's basically what was said. So they didn't get anything out of it, and they're not going to, because the US went trying to bully the Chinese into doing exactly what they want. It's highly detrimental, and the US foreign policy is dysfunctional, and it's doing the Trump administration no favors.
Yeah, it's dysfunctional and it's murderous, Paul. That's the problem with it. It's schizophrenic.
And for so long, Trump was doing well. He was making all the right noises. Certainly, I think there was significant progress being made. And then what do we see? It's like they've, the one thing that's happening, and this is what also Washington's not realizing, is that this old sort of hegemonic kind of foreign policy power play mentality is disintegrating all around the world. It's not working anymore. And whilst, European nations have supported the US over airstrikes in Syria, there's no support for the US with regards to the JCPOA. Now, if someone's telling me it's a cabal agreement, are we then saying that Russia's cabal and China's cabal? We're getting told in the one breath that there's this grand collusion between Trump and Putin to remove the cabal, and in the next breath we're being told that the Russians are supporting a cabal JCPOA agreement. So which one is it? It's ridiculous. The logic collapses in 10 seconds. I find that frustrating, because if people just thought about what's actually going on, they'd go, hang on, there's no logic to this. You can't say that the Russians and the US have got this grand collusion 4D chess plan between Trump and Putin, which actually doesn't even exist. But it does exist. But in the next breath, but this JCPOA agreement's cabal, and that's why Iran's going to be overthrown. When who are the biggest supporters of Iran in the JCPOA is the Chinese and the Russians. So the logic collapses in 10 seconds. And that's an important consideration. That's why it's worth discussing in huge detail what the reality is behind the JCPOA and what's really going on. Because it then destroys these simplistic narratives that, if you have an understanding and a grasp of the history and the reality of what's gone on with Iran in the Middle East and relations or previous relations with China, Russia, and the US and Western powers, you realize quite quickly who really wants the JCPOA trashing. And we know it's the cabal, we know it's the neocons, because the neocons have done everything to destabilize the US for decades. After all, they've backed, as we said, they backed Iraq. They backed Saddam Hussein in a war with Iran, even though Saddam Hussein was the arch enemy. They backed him in a war because they wanted him to defeat the Iranians. What does that tell us about their intentions towards Iran? They don't want Iran to become a democracy, or what they perceive to be a democracy. They want the current Iranian government out because they're doing everything to thwart them in terms of de-dollarization, in terms of energy. Iran's a huge energy provider. The deals they're signing with the Russians and the Chinese, they're doing everything the cabal despises, and why they removed Gaddafi and why they removed Saddam Hussein. Because if you think about it, they allowed those two leaders to be in power for decades and did nothing. They were so concerned about humanitarian need of these people. They would have done it years before. They only did it because Gaddafi said, I want a gold-backed dinar, I want the end of the dollar. And what did Saddam Hussein say? I want to trade oil in euros and not in the US dollar. That's why they were both, regime change and murdered.
Absolutely.
And it's it just goes on and on. Every single time, it's the same MO with the cabal. They do the same thing in every single nation. It's all about economics. If you ditch the dollar, then they're going to try and overthrow you and remove you. So why are they doing it? They can't do it to the Russians, and they can't do it to the Chinese.
Exactly.
But so a nation like Iran, Iran's de-dollarizing. Iran's reintegrating into the world, into the new paradigm. We've said the Berlin, Moscow, Beijing axis. Well, you can attach Tehran as a major hub off that.
Yes.
They don't want that to happen. Right. Because they don't want any nation to be economically strong. And here's the bottom line. What we're seeing now in the US, the seeds of the US's destruction was actually came about during the Clinton administration. Because what did they do? They exported the US manufacturing base to China. That was the beginning of the end of the US economically. And like all these things, it takes 10, 20 years, in this case, around 20 years, for the wheels to fall off in totality. All we're seeing now is the consequences of those actions. The US is, unfortunately, is being destroyed internally by very crass economic policy. And then in 2008, when they may have had a chance to readdress the problems, no, the cabal went, no, it's QE and zero interest rate policy that's wrecked every country who's ever implemented it for more than a few months. The US has had that for nigh on 10 years, as of other Western nations, and it's economic disaster. So when you combine all these problems, the US is backed itself into its own corner. And unfortunately, who are the people who suffer? Of course, it's the people in the process. And that's why for Trump needs to sit down and go, well, yeah, the Trump administration completely screwed up our economic policy. Yes, we have this huge imbalance with China, but let's sit down and work with the Chinese, because China would do it. If you said, right, let's have some sensible Chinese investment in the US, or can we have some investment of US business into China? Then great. There are possibilities. The other problem is, the big risk is, and I don't say this lightly, if the US carries on doing what it's doing globally in geopolitical terms, you might well start to see big investors in the US, and there are some from foreign nations, they may just all go, we're pulling out, we're leaving, because we're not putting up with this anymore. This is the big problem. You can't treat nations like a business deal. Trump is not a politician by his own admission. He's a different president. He's not, and in a way, it's refreshing. He's not a cabal president, absolutely, but he's trying to treat nations like China like a business deal, and you simply can't do it. And China will not allow it, and they will not tolerate it or permit it. And this is very detrimental. So I think the next 2 or 3 weeks might be a very, very defining moment in history where we turn around and go, that was the moment when the US turns one way or the other. And I hope for all their friends, we have in the US, and everybody else that they turn the right way, because that way it will help the US going forward. Because the point is, it's not about the now, it's about how do we as nations strive to become adaptive towards the new political, social, economic paradigm. The nations like Russia and China have been doing it for years. I mean, people talk about the reset, yes, but Russia's had its reset already. It spent 15,
Absolutely.
20 years in the economic doldrums after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yep.
It's now in economically resurgent. It's got a long way to go, but it's making all the right steps. I mean, Putin's in for another 6 years, and we haven't got round to, well, maybe we'll discuss what he said in his speech. Some highly interesting developments, which are all tipping towards the new paradigm. There's a lot of work. China's done the same thing. They've been through the reset. They've already been through it. The Western nations haven't even started to come to terms with what needs to be done. So we'll see what develops with regard to the JCPOA. But the fact we spent an hour on it is because it needs that kind of discussion rather than, oh, the JCPOA is this knee-jerk kind of discussion about things with no substance and no context. And there needs to be far more discussion about all these things with context and discussion, not little sound bites, little cryptic messages that don't tell us anything. Then they don't mean anything. It leaves things far too open for people to have a subjective viewpoint rather than an objective viewpoint. And the whole basis of what we do is to be objective. I've got no political side. You know, if Russia and China came out tomorrow with the most insane policies, we'd slaughter them for it. Yeah. We'll slaughter any nation or anybody who comes out with insane policies that are damaging to humanity. But the Chinese and the Russians aren't doing that. Neither are there are other nations that are transitioning and have got a long way to go. I mean, the African continent's a great example, and there's massive developments going on there all the time. And, you know, I come out with the thing, the Western nations are all squabbling about stupid things, and meanwhile the adults in the room get on with doing what needs to be done, which is economic, geopolitical and bilateral win-win situation for nations across the world. It's not rocket science, and there's a need for nations, and particularly the US, to just focus on that instead of focusing on, you know, on Twitter, all I see is comments about Stormy Daniels. Frankly, who cares? Just ignore the person. Just forget about them. Just focus on the things that need to be done and get the debate stimulated in the US about the real problems that exist. Not all this kind of knee-jerk alternative media sensationalism. They're like tabloids we have in the UK. They write sensational headlines about things that don't matter. Get people to discuss the real thing instead of, you know, when I say something about the US economy, I just get people with all these laughing faces going, well, that's a load of rubbish. You don't know what you're talking about.
Because they're a bunch of idiots, Paul. These are the morons who believe there's a 3.5% unemployment rate. These are the morons who don't understand any sort of real macro metric or real fundamentals of basically anything. They're idiots of the grandest order, man.
Well, yeah, I mean, how could you possibly have 3.5% unemployment in the US?
Yeah.
I mean,
exactly.
Just look at all the macro that proves. I mean, 90 odd million people economically inactive. I mean, alone, and then of course, just look at how they fudge all the statistics for unemployment. They do it. They've done it in the UK. They do it probably all over Western Europe. There's people in the U3 category and the U6, and then they move people into the U6 out the U3, and then after a while, they completely remove them off the U6, and they don't even exist in the system anymore.
Yeah.
They're still unemployed. And it's all to do with, well, are they actively looking for work? Well, no. So we'll just remove them out the statistics like they do in the UK. They force people who are unemployed to take these jobs. Well, jobs is probably the wrong word, but in a way, they have to earn their benefits. If they don't take them, they stop their benefits. But while they do these jobs, they're not registered as unemployed, but they're still unemployed. And the list goes on. There's all these fudges to make people believe unemployment rates are low. You know, and here's the point. And someone said to me about, well, you're saying unemployment rate in the US is 20% or thereabouts. Go, well, if you don't believe me, ask Donald Trump why he spent a year and a half before his election going on about the unemployment rate was a big lie. And it was at least 20%. He said some people said it was 42%. So Trump suddenly goes from not being in office, telling the truth, and now he's lording over the fact that US unemployment's the lowest it's been. I mean, no one needs to ask the question, why is he doing this? When it's plainly obvious US unemployment has flatlined around 20-odd% since 2008. In fact, it's spiked up to probably about 26, 27%. Now it's probably around 23%. And that's a conservative estimate. That's the reality of what goes on. And yet, but people will just buy things. What I don't get is it's like they'll buy everything they're told about foreign policy. It's the same in the UK. And yet they'll buy everything in the party they believe in. And yet the one thing they said, everything about what the opposition party says is a lie, it's spin, it's twisted. But they never believe that that could possibly be the case about their nation's foreign policy, about what their government's doing.
Yep.
When some government's in power, they believe everything the government says because they believe in the government. Well, they should believe in the reality of things. Don't believe in anybody because you voted for them. Believe in them by their actions and what they're actually doing, the reality of what they're doing. That's what frustrates me, is why I despise party politics, because it polarizes people. And you know what? I think the saddest thing that's happened, I don't think I've ever seen in all my life the US such a divided nation amongst the people. And if you have a divided nation, how are you ever going to rebuild it and make it strong again? It's so divided. And it's divided by this political divide. And it needs to stop. People need to come together and go, do you know what? What's better for the people of the United States? What do we need to do to make the country better for us as people? I don't care whether you vote for Democrats or Republicans, you believe in Trump, you believe in whoever. It really is irrelevant. What's relevant is what needs to actually be done. And that's the fear I have, is the US is becoming ever more polarized, ever more partisan. And in the end, how's that going to help the US rebuild as a nation in the new paradigm? I mean, what's the one thing, whether you like Chinese politics or not, you got the Chinese people, they're all galvanized around Xi. It's the same in Russia. 90% approval rating or more for Putin because they're galvanized around a leader who believes in them as a nation and wants to change it. That is how because then you've got the whole nation working together. At the moment, you've got elements in the US who are pulling in one direction and elements pulling in the other. And all they're going to do is rip each other apart.
Yep, absolutely. Paul, thank you so much for being on. We are out of time for today. Folks, again, if you haven't got a chance to do this, go to thesiriusreport.com, subscribe to the membership for less than $5 a month, for $4.75. You're going to get a subscription to sanity. That's what I call it, subscription to sanity. Do it, thesiriusreport.com. Also subscribe to the YouTube channel over here, over at roguemoney.net. Subscribe, like, comment, share, and Paul will be back next Monday for another edition of the Sirius Report. With that being said, we're over and out. Take it away, El Cuco.